The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
Hey, it's Tuesday morning, everybody. Welcome to Squawk Box Europe with Karen Cho and Juliana Tattlebaum and Steve Sedgwick. And these are your headlines. Well, the US has extended its China tariff deadline by another 90 days, allowing talks to continue, with Beijing pledging to hold off on further escalation.
President Trump confirms the US government will take a 15% cut of top chipmakers' China sales and suggests he could allow Nvidia to begin exporting a downgraded version of its advanced Blackwell chip.
And EU leaders, apart from Hungary, say the people of Ukraine must have the freedom to decide their future ahead of the Trump-Putin summit, while the U.S. president seems to downplay the chances of a breakthrough.
Well, we're going to have a meeting with Vladimir Putin, and at the end of that meeting, probably in the first 2 minutes, I'll know exactly whether or not a deal can be made.
How will you know that?
Because that's what I do. I make deals.
On first blush, good morning to you. Good morning, good morning.
Very good morning.
We've got some data. Richka's going to join us for a deep dive on UK data in a few moments' time. Safe to say, I think at first blush, this is mildly better than the government and many of the doomsters out there for the UK economy would have expected. Average weekly earnings down 4.6% year on year, which the poll was going for up 4.7. That's better for the Bank of England and its measures to try and get rates down further. Of course, we had a cut in UK rates last week. The jobless rate, 4.7% on the ILO measure. That's the International Labour Organization. But in terms of other data there, average weekly private sector earnings, ex bonuses, someone remind me what a bonus is, up 4.8% in the 3 months to June. But ONS says in July 2025, there were 8,000 fewer people payrolled in employment when compared with June 2025. So there's more people working in terms of UK employment was up 239,000 3 months on 3 months in the 3 months to June. The poll was only looking for 185. So I think by and large, mildly positive data. The pound looks like it's had a little bit of a blip to the upside, 134.35.
I'm not surprised because I know that the dire labour market forecast that were coming through in recent weeks was really putting some sort of shadow over the UK. So this is quite interesting to see this data this morning.
Yeah, solid but unspectacular. I think they'd say that. What else is going on in the world?
Well, we're going to have plenty more on the data with Ritika shortly. But now, one of the other top stories we're watching stateside, the White House confirming that Nvidia and AMD will now pay 15% of Chinese revenues to the U.S. government as a license fee in return for the right to export certain chips to the country. The move throws security claims surrounding China's use of the firm's chips into question, as we were discussing yesterday, and takes the Trump administration into murky legal territory on taxing exports, some experts say. In a press conference, Trump downplayed security concerns surrounding the deal on Nvidia's H20 chips.
This is an old chip that China already has, and I deal with Jensen, who's a great guy, and Nvidia. The chip that we're talking about, the H20, it's an old chip. China already has it in a different form, different name, but they have it. Or they have a combination of two will make up for it and even then some. Now Jensen's a very brilliant guy, and Jensen also has a new chip, the Blackwell. Do you know what the Blackwell is? The Blackwell is super duper advanced. I wouldn't make a deal with that, although it's possible I'd make a deal, a somewhat enhanced in a negative way Blackwell. In other words, take 30% to 50% off of it. But that's the latest and the greatest in the world. Nobody has it. They won't have it for 5 years. But the H20 is obsolete. You know, it's one of those things, but it still has a market. So I said, listen, I want 20% if I'm going to approve this for you, for the country, for our country, for the U.S. I don't want it myself. You know, every time I say like 747, I want, yeah, for the Air Force. So I just wanted. So when I say I want 20, I want for the country. I only care about the country. I don't care about myself. And He said, would you make it 15? So we negotiated a little deal.
Elaine, this is a huge news for the Chinese market, who has been shut out of using chips like these. What does it mean for China to be looking at the prospect of now getting access to not only the H20 chips from Nvidia, but potentially a downgraded version of the more advanced chips?
Right, and these revenant cut deals have stunned a lot of people, of course, particularly in the U.S. But Beijing isn't making this easy. So after Beijing summoned Nvidia asking for proof that the H20 doesn't have security vulnerabilities, state-affiliated media has amplified those concerns, not just on the chip's safety, but also on its environmental credentials and also its performance. That's after U.S. officials have openly said that they're only giving second fiddle technology to China. And there are questions about whether all this talk about the cybersecurity risks is posturing. And we've seen Chinese companies demonstrating a huge appetite for these Nvidia chips. But Beijing is basically juggling both short-term and longer-term goals here. And Arthur Krober of Gafgol Dragonomics earlier told us today that on the one hand, Beijing is promoting technological self-sufficiency, which could be a 5 to 10 year project. But on the other hand, China has also enabled these gray area channels or transshipments to allow Nvidia to flow into China, even though if these chips are export controlled. So China could potentially find ways to get their hands on these chips, even if they say they don't want these chips. But there also could be growing opposition from the U.S. side, as some have warned in the policy and business circles that it may not serve the U.S.'s interest to tie these short-term trade-related concessions to the country's long-term AI tech and critical technology strategy there. Back to you.
Elaine, thank you very much for bringing us the latest there around the Nvidia story. You can find out more on what the deal means for Nvidia and AMD and for the world on our website. President Trump extended the tariff deadline with China for another 90 days as expected, hours before the previous pause on levies was set to end. This new extension will expire on the 10th of November. China, for its part, said it would hold off on its own retaliatory tariffs for the same period of time. Sean Rain joins us, founder and managing director, China Market Research Group. Sean, thank you very much for joining us today. The pause we've got from both sides on tariffs suggests current state of play remains, but all importantly, that Christmas influx of goods can come through from the Chinese market to fill up the shelves stateside. What do you make of the politics here and what the two sides are angling for?
Well, it's great to be here, Karen. I'm actually in Texas in the United States right now. I just arrived because I'm doing a road show to meet with hedge funds. But in the last week or two that I've been here, Karen, it's very clear that inflation remains a serious problem for the American consumer. You're starting to see that tariff prices were held off during the first Liberation Day, and a lot of retailers from Walmart to Amazon pre-bought a lot of products. And so it's only now that you're starting to see tariff products are starting to sell to the American consumer. So it's really clear that China is winning in the trade war against the United States because they have so much manufacturing dominance. Again, like 98% of the world's antibiotics comes through China at some point. So Trump has had to really bow down to Xi Jinping and the Chinese in many ways by extending this 90-day truce. Because if you don't do that, then come Christmas time and come the midterm elections next year, the American consumer is going to vote against Trump and vote against Republicans. That's why China clearly has the upper hand, not just here, but also as you were talking about with the H20 chips from Nvidia. It's clear that the United States wants to sell more to China right now, while China doesn't really need the United States as much, except for buying ethane, because everything else that China wants from the United States, it can buy from other countries, like beef from Australia, oil from Canada, rather than from the United States right now. And importantly, long term, it's that self-indigenous drive where Chinese chips from Huawei and SMIC and other companies are focused because the Chinese security are just worried about, can you trust Nvidia or AMD right now if they're giving 15% of their revenue to the United States? in many ways, the U.S. is more Chinese than China ever was in
Sean,
terms of being a dictatorship.
Sean, just to get into the weeds on this, is there a timing issue? Because if you look at the optics around the tariffs so far, there is a view that, well, the tariffs are not being as punishing as first thought. But we know if we get into the weeds on it, that the reciprocal tariffs were not the level that companies were facing. Companies themselves try to get around the tariffs. They've warned some of the cost of it. Consumers are only taking on some of the brunt of the tariff increase. Is there a timing play here for the president to ensure that the biggest hit is not upfront?
Yeah, well, that's why you have the extension today. I mean, China's government announced that they were going to extend another 90 days. That lack of tariffs and the lack of the non-reliable entity list where they pinpointed against some American companies like Lockheed Martin, by extending 90 days into middle of November, that ensures that American consumers can be able to buy products from Chinese manufacturers without the high tariffs. But like I said, when I've been interviewing American consumers the last week or two, their biggest concern, aside from safety on the streets, is high inflation. I mean, product prices are still really high in grocery stores and in the Walmarts and Amazons of the world, especially since President Trump got rid of the de minimis law of $800 and less tax or tariff free from products from companies like Shein and Temu. So you're starting to see the American consumers really starting to hurt on inflation. That's why I'm quite negative for the economy over the next 6 to 12 months. And I think that equity investors should be looking more towards Hong Kong equity markets and potentially even A shares in the coming quarter, Karen.
Sean, when it comes to who's going to absorb the cost of these tariffs, whether it be costs on Chinese products in particular or tariffs around the world, we're all trying to debate how it will all shake out between foreign suppliers, many of whom are in China, the Western corporates themselves, or the U.S. consumer. Based on your relationship with Chinese companies, to what extent do you think that the Chinese supply chain will be willing to absorb some of these higher tariff costs?
The Chinese companies are not absorbing the higher costs right now. At the end of the day, because Trump went after India, has gone after Vietnam, Cambodia, Japan, every other country in the world, the Chinese suppliers are saying, you know what, we're going to hold firm on the pricing and just have that transfer to the American company. The American companies are just transferring that down to the end American consumer. I think Trump's strategic mistake was he didn't contain and isolate China specifically, but he went after all countries in the world. And so you're seeing high tariffs all over the place. It's like when you look at it with the auto sector, Trump put a lot onto Japan, then eased it off, and it's actually now cheaper in many ways for Toyota or Honda to sell cars in the United States than it is for Ford and GM. And that's why you see Jim Farley, the CEO of Ford, is criticizing Trump for the tariffs. So the Chinese are not going to eat the costs anymore. They did that last year. They did that 2 years ago. We've reached the point that the tariffs are so high that they can't absorb the costs anymore. It's the end of the day, it's going to be the American consumers that's going to be paying. And that's what's confusing, because Trump has basically enacted the largest tax hike in the history of the United States without approval of Congress. But a lot of his supporters don't seem to realize that they are paying the costs. And they think that the Treasury is, raising hundreds of billions of dollars a year from these tariffs, and they're cheering this. But that's not coming from China. That's a tax on the American people.
Sean, one of the remarkable features of Chinese leadership of the Communist Party is that they have an extremely long-term view. Their actions are dictated by this long-term vision, in contrast to many Western leaders, the U.S. included, which obviously leadership runs on a 4-year cycle. When it comes to China's long-term vision, are you seeing glimpses of any changes to what their long-term priorities are as a result of the events of the last 6 months?
Well, I think China is trying to reduce its reliance on America as a trade partner. You go back in 2017, 18% of China's exports were allocated towards the United States. That number is down to only 14%. In actuality, India exports more as a percentage of their economy to the United States when you include services than China does. So over the last 6 months, you've seen an acceleration of China trying to build up to the global south. I prefer to call it the global majority, and come up with new trade partners. Now you see Modi, the Prime Minister of India, is coming to China this week for the first time in 7 years. Lulu, the president of Brazil, is clearly fighting against aggression from the United States and the 50% tariffs, and he's moving closer to China. So China is really saying, you know what, from a long-term perspective, let's not worry about quarterly numbers on exports to the United States. Let's move towards shoring up economic and political strength with the global South or global majority. And I think what's happened with India in the last couple of weeks has been the greatest present for President Xi and the Chinese. You know, tension has been terrible with the Indians over the last 5 years, and we're starting to see a thawing out because now Indians are saying, you know what, maybe Trump is trying to contain India the same way that Trump is trying to contain China. And so you have the two world's most populous nations are finally getting closer. You're starting to see direct flights are coming back together again. This is why I'm bullish for China, not so much over the next quarter, but over the next 3 to 5 years because of that long-term strategic thinking, like you just asked.
Yeah, but Sean, I read a good book. I think it was called The Split. I don't know who the author was. And it was talking about the change in this Chinese consumer. And that's what I want to ask you about, because you've quite clearly said they're not rushing back to market to spend a lot of money at the moment. They're cautious. They love their savings. They don't feel they've got the social safety net. But when they do come back, it's going to be a different consumer. Why don't you just update us on the different consumer that we're going to see this time around compared with previously? It's not going to be about things so much. It's going to be more about lifestyle.
Steve, great to hear from you, and I hope you get that big bonus come Christmas time for mentioning my book. Thank you. I think one of the biggest changes that I think the rest of Asia and Europe needs to expect is that the Chinese tourist is not going to be the freewheeling, big spending tourist that it was in 2019. In 2019, 180 million Chinese traveled abroad to basically shop. They would go to the Champs-Élysées in Paris and buy Louis Vuitton handbags. They'd go to Fifth Avenue in New York, buy Gucci. What you're starting to see is because we've basically dealt with 5-6 years of a rough economy where income levels aren't high, where youth unemployment still hovers around 13-14%, there's still a lot of anxiety that the Chinese consumer is not going to go out and spend when traveling. Now, last month I was in Thailand. You could see that a lot of the stores were bereft or empty of Chinese consumers. The number of Chinese consumers down to Thailand has dropped 30% year on year, and that's really hitting the luxury space. So I'm quite negative on, say, Minor Group or AOT, the airport operators in Thailand, because the Chinese consumer just isn't traveling abroad to spend. What they are doing is they're spending on cheap 3-star, 4-star tourist destinations domestically in China. They're going to Xinjiang, they're going to Tibet, they're going to Yunnan, which is really why I like Etour, which is a 3-4-star Chinese hotel chain. It's cheap. It's about 300-400 RMB a night. Great service. I've stayed there dozens of nights, really enjoy it. And I expect that stock to really pop, because the Chinese are just not going to be fueling luxury sales and outbound travel anytime soon.
Sean, there is, and absolutely, and it's fascinating. And again, I do recommend your book, actually. It's very good. But the truth of the matter is, this is fascinating for an investment point of view for our viewers, if indeed that is the case. That means luxury goods, which the big growth driver was the Chinese consumer. No doubt about it, over the last 10, 15 years or so. That could be a serious banana skin over the longer term. This isn't just a short-term cycle now. And the same goes for the big hotel groups. It goes for the big auto groups as well. That is a massive sea change and something our viewers from an investment point of view need to know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you see Mercedes and BMW have both seen 20 to 30% drops year over year in sales in China. You know, Chinese consumers are moving towards BYD and Xiaomi. You know, these car companies are 30 to 50% cheaper than the Germans. You know, they use electric batteries, so it's a lot cheaper than gasoline to use over a year period. So if I was an investor, I'd be looking at the battery makers like BYD and CATL, because they're powering up NEV sales. Over 60% of new auto sales in China this year were actually Chinese NEVs. Again, I think luxury is in a real rut, and this is going to take years, certainly quarters, for Louis Vuitton and Gucci and Burberry to crawl out of their hole, because there is that fundamental shift in the Chinese consumer. It's not just economic and cyclical, it's also just how they're viewing the world. I would be looking more at sort of cheap plays kind of the lipstick effect where Chinese are stressed out, so they're spending more money on small premium items. So aside from domestic tourism, like to a tour, I also like Pop Mart and the Labubu trend. A lot of investors tell me that Labubu is a fad, but what they don't realize is that Pop Mart's overall IP is really strong. Pop Mart just opened up the world's largest Pop Mart last week in Thailand, because Thai consumers just love not just Labubu, but all of Pop Mart's IP. So I expect that Pop Mart is going to be able to grow, not just in China, but also internationally and become a global player. So investors should be looking at cheap but premium product lines. So BYD or Xiaomi when it comes to handsets, cheap but premium, or Pop Mart when it comes to IP. That's where Chinese consumers are spending right now. They're just not going to be buying the Porsches, the BMWs, the Mercedes anytime soon, Steve.
Sean, great to see you washed up in Austin. No, not washed up in Austin. It's just a lyric. I'm joking. Thank you very much indeed. And what Labubu? I mean, Labubu? Don't get me on it, Sean. I've got kids and my youngest just wasted a load of money on Labubu. Sean Rain, thank you, sir. Founder and Managing Director of China Market Research Group. Coming up on the show, President Trump appears to downplay the prospects of a peace deal ahead of a key summit with Russia's President Putin. Plus, the search for a new Fed chair reportedly widens as President Trump looks to select a replacement for Jay Powell. And we're going to break down the results from the Norge Bank Investment Management Group with the Deputy CEO, Tom de Grande. That conversation coming up at 9:45 London time.
UK retail sales rose 2.5% on the year in July, according to the British Retail Consortium, driven by near 4% growth in food sales. However, the BRC says that growth was largely driven by food inflation rather than demand growth, and that sales growth at these levels is, quote, barely touching the sides of covering the costs retailers are facing as a result of the UK government's changes to tax and the minimum wage. UK employment grew by a greater than expected 238,000 in 3 months to June. According to the ONS data, the number of job vacancies declined by 44,000 in the May to July period, marking the 37th consecutive period of quarterly fall. So Ritika joins us with more. Ritika, last week as we were weighing up whether the Bank of England would move on interest rates, there was a very dire picture that was painted around the employment market. That doesn't really seem to be accurate given what we're seeing in the data today.
Yes, Karen, it was precisely the fact that there's a deteriorating labour market that gave the Bank of England confidence to cut rates, because their argument was that the deterioration in labour, that's going to feed through into wages and then continue on a disinflation path. But what we're seeing today is surprisingly a better picture than expected for the employment data. We've seen 238,000 jobs added in the 3 months to June, and payrolled employees down 8,000 for the month of July. That's actually the smallest decline since January, and less than the 20,000 that was expected. Remember, though, this number is quite prone to revision, so we'll have to see, but it does suggest a better picture than expected, especially at a time when Rachel Reeves has been under a lot of pressure, that she's been raising the cost base for employers with the national insurance contributions and the hike in the minimum wage. So this is likely to provide her some relief today. But it is interesting, like you said, what kind of implications does it have on fiscal and monetary policy?
Let me give the other side of the coin to both of you. I think that on ONS data is a blunt instrument. And of course, there's lots of questions about the ONS data at the moment as well. And we know that there's a big assault on the credibility of the Statistics Bureau at the moment. But hiring tensions in Britain's businesses are at a record low. So, and this is about future jobs rather than current jobs as well. And so I hear what you're saying, and absolutely, I'm not trying to reinvent what the data says today. It's stable. There's no doubt about it. It's stable compared with where we were last time. But if hiring tensions are at a record low, that is a damning indictment of a government which promised to give us growth.
And you're quite right that the data is foggy as well. So I think that's something that we're going to have to continue to evaluate, because they've had low responses in their surveys. So it's it's difficult to form a picture for the Bank of England, for instance, about whether to push or pull, what direction to go in when the data hasn't been that clear. And if you look at other surveys, as Steve was pointing to, we have seen that suggest that there's growing worker availability, fewer vacancies, and this downward pressure on wages. So yes, maybe it's better than expected, but that doesn't mean it's totally robust.
When it comes to those hiring intentions, we're seeing in the U.S. that the tech sector is actually where you're seeing those hiring intentions slow. And I wonder to what extent that's what's happening here in the U.K. as well, that as a result of AI coming into the fold, companies are reconsidering whether they want to hire or rehire for more entry-level and positions that can be replaced by AI.
Dare I say it, what is entry-level nowadays as well? A lot of questions being raised about the worth of spending tens, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds on getting a degree education, a postgraduate education. Where do you want to start your hiring process as well? Because it's a lot cheaper to pick up someone who's 18 rather than 21 and train them with an apprenticeship.
I think the AI point is interesting. Are we going to start to see that into the data with graduate employees and middle class workers? But for now, it is we are seeing that, as you said, firms are slowing on their hiring front, and they were expecting this summer hiatus where we wouldn't see a lot of hiring until the autumn budget when we start to get more clarity.